People want government to keep us safe and keep us from being cheated. And so politicians and bureaucrats keep passing and adding more rules. Here they are. That's how many the feds alone have passed. They add 1,000 new pages of this garbage. No, laws, regulations, every week. But I say it doesn't help us. It just enriches lawyers and bureaucrats. It makes us poorer and less safe and less free. And one of the few politicians in the Senate who understands that is Utah Senator Mike Lee. So I'm glad you're there with all those socialists, and I'm glad you understand it. You got it. Your father used to talk about the Constitution at the breakfast table?
Yes, and the lunch and dinner table as well. We talked about it a lot.
And what's going on? How do you see this happening? How do you see it ever being solved?
Well, it's easy for elected politicians to want to speak in lofty, glowing terms about things that sound perfectly unobjectionable. Let's have clean air, for example. And so we
I'm
pass
for
a law.
clean air.
Yeah, who isn't? But then we outsource the task of defining what clean air means and how that's going to be enforced. And those people who make those rules, which are, as you point out, laws, those people aren't elected, and they don't work for anyone who is elected. And that's a problem.
And you wrote a book, Chapter 7, you talk about the federal regulatory monster.
Yes. Our laws, most of them, are not being passed, are not being put in place by people who are elected. This is utterly incompatible with Article 1, Section 1 and Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution, which went out of their way to make sure anyone making laws, that is, rules carrying the force of generally applicable law, have to be passed by people in Congress who are elected every 2 years in the case of the House and every 6 years in the case of the Senate.
And I'll play devil's advocate. So what? It's all stuff that's supposed to make life better.
It's supposed to make life better, and we want to believe that it will. We want there to be clean air. We want to pursue all the broad, lofty goals that are promised to us in these broad laws passed by Congress. But one of the problems that we have is when you insulate those who write those laws and who are also the same people enforcing them from the people affected by them and from the voters, then they don't look at the fact that they're not always accomplishing what they're supposed to accomplish. In fact, sometimes they're having exactly the opposite effect, and they're making all of us poorer.
And, I mean, intuition tells us that passing laws is a good thing. The kids who tour the state capitals in D.C., they don't come up to you and say, Senator, what laws did you repeal? They say, what have you gotten passed? That's being a good citizen.
That's right. And politicians tend to be given the most accolades when they pass laws or when they fund programs to the tune of billions and billions of dollars at a time. That's when we get praised the most, and we need to start recognizing that individuals regulate themselves much better than government can in most areas.
So I wrote a book titled No They Can't, playing off Obama's Yes We Can slogan, which argues that it's intuitive to think that government has to do these things, that without these new rules, life would be ugly, the poor would suffer.
I've read your book, and I
good. I like it when senators read this thing.
And I love it. This sends a message that people need to read. And it's absolutely correct that intuitively we want to believe those things. But as you point out in your book, sometimes our intuition is wrong. This is one of those areas where human intuition often is wrong. Perhaps it's something primal in us. Perhaps it's something cultural that wants us to think, yeah, let's have some of these important decisions made village-wide. But village-wide, of course...
It feels good,
village-wide. It feels good. It does. Village-wide is very different than nationwide, especially in a nation of 300 million people like ours.
I mean, it's so odd to hear a senator say this. It's great. I mean, you went to law school at BYU. I assume they taught you, like they teach all lawyers, that life can be managed through paper and procedure, top down.
The law itself lends itself to that kind of thinking. And it's not altogether wrong. I mean, there are, after all, some areas in which it's totally appropriate for us to have this sort of village elder deference on a national scale. For instance, when it comes to matters of national defense, when it's time for us to go to war, we need to rally behind a common leader, and we've identified that leader as the President of the United States.
Anything else?
Regulating trade between the states and with foreign nations. That has to be handled at the national level.
Why does it need regulation? Why can't people trade voluntarily whatever they want?
Well, it's the extent of the regulation is, of course, the critical question that we have to answer. Congress over the last 75 years, with a little assistance from the Supreme Court, has kind of seen that as a perpetually green light.
Now, in terms of the regulatory burden, where, as you say, they're on automatic pilot, 1,000 pages a week added, you have a sunset proposal that would stop that.
Yes. The best proposal out there right now to deal with the mission creep associated with the modern federal regulatory state is a proposal called the Reins Act, R-E-I-N-S.
Rein them in.
Rein them in. It's a measure of which I'm an original co-sponsor in the Senate. And here's what it says. It says that anytime you have a new regulation carrying the force of generally applicable federal law, if it qualifies as a major rule under the OMB's review standards, meaning it has an economic impact in excess of $100 million annually nationwide, relatively easy hurdle to satisfy, by the way, then that regulation will be viewed as a proposal, and it won't take effect until it's been passed into law by the House of Representatives and by the Senate, and then it's been submitted to the President for signature or veto. In other words, we're requiring the Congress to follow the same procedure to enact these into law, such that no such regulation meeting these criteria could become law without Congress acting. That's exactly what the Founding Fathers intended, and that's what we need to do here.